Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. If you're struggling in your marriage, or maybe you're wondering if it's even salvageable, before you give up or before you let things get too hard, let us come alongside you and help you solidify your marriage. We offer biblical encouragement and insight to help you strengthen your marriage.
Hey listeners, we're glad you are here today. Welcome to the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast. We're Doug and Leslie Davis, and today we're talking about 5 ways to fortify your marriage using covenant principles.
And we've talked about covenants before. As a matter of fact, back in episode 3, we talked about living out of a covenant relationship. And one of the things we'll be talking about today, we dealt with in episode number 11 with honoring your spouse. But today, we're going to be looking not just at covenant relationship, but the vows that we take when we promise to live in covenant with one another.
I think a lot of times people are so focused on the marriage ceremony that they don't understand the weight of the vows that they take before God and before man, and it kind of gets forgotten after the cake's cut.
Right. You know? And living in covenant is about living within the promises that you make. One of the things that we shared back in episode 3 is that the difference between a covenant and a contract is if you're in a contract and the other side doesn't hold up their end of the bargain, you don't have to hold up yours either. You're released from it completely. And living in covenant is the way that God chooses to interact with us. He does what he promised he would do simply because he promised that he would, not because we were able to hold up our end of the bargain. And to be quite honest with you, we're never able to fully hold up our end of the bargain. But we know that we get the privilege to live in that kind of a covenant relationship with our spouse. And so what we're talking about is that covenant is about promises, and you have an opportunity to be a person of your word when you really think about the promises that you make on your wedding day to your spouse.
One of the things that we spoke about before is being in a covenant relationship doesn't hold you tight to an abusive situation.
Right.
So we just want to put that out there right now. If you're in an abusive situation and you're trying to live in a covenant, that covenant's already broken. It's not divorce that breaks a covenant. It is the behavior within the relationship before you even get to the point of divorce. So we're not saying stay in an abusive relationship. We want you to stay safe. So hear that, because that's really an important part of the whole conversation as we talk about covenant marriage.
And one of the other parts of the conversation as we talk about a covenant marriage and a covenant relationship and how you can fortify your marriage using these principles is to understand that you are able to control the behavior in relationship to the promises you made. It's a dangerous thing when you feel like you need to manipulate your spouse and try to control the promises your spouse made. Yeah. That's going to be unhealthy. And so again, we don't want you to stay in an abusive relationship. We also don't want you to live in an unhealthy relationship trying to demand that your spouse lives up to his or her promises. But instead, we want to encourage you to understand what it means to live up to the promises that you made.
So let's jump right in. Our 5 principles today come from the vows that are generally said during a wedding ceremony.
Right. And we're not talking about the trend lately. I know that the trend lately is that
I'll write my own.
The vows will be written by the couple, and they're designed to make the people who are in the audience laugh, and sometimes they're not even fully appropriate, but they're really funny. And that's not what we're talking about at all, even though that's the trend. What we're talking about are the items that have been promised for a very long time in what the traditional wedding vows are. And again, it may not be exactly the same words, but we're talking about this is amazing to me, for more than 600 years, there's been a standard set of 5 things that are promised a lot in the United States, in Western Europe, and in other places. These 5 things have been promised by husbands and wives to one another for over 600 years. Chances are, if you had anything close to a traditional set of wedding vows, these 5 things are things that you promised to your spouse. Now, you may not have understood understood what you were promising at the time. But that doesn't mean that from today forward, you can't take those promises seriously and say, I want to begin living up to the things that I promised I would do for you.
How many wedding ceremonies would you say you've done since you've started pastoring?
I have done 83 wedding ceremonies since I started pastoring. And in those 83 services, these promises in one form or another were made in every one of them.
So let me quickly run down what they are, and then we'll jump back and break them down for you. The 5 covenant principles are love, honor, cherish, forsaking all others, and cling to your spouse.
And so as we start to look at those, we'll break them down one at a time. We know that these principles are things that you understand. What we want to encourage you to do is to look at ways that you can live out these promises that you've made in a way that may be fresh and new for you. So let's start with love. What exactly does it mean when you say, I promise to love you?
Well, when you start researching something, what do you usually start with? I start with the definition. And I'm going to rabbit trail right here for just a second, because one of the people who really turned me on to the love of defining words is Angie Bauman. And she was my podcast mentor. And today, as the day of recording, her and her husband Matt are celebrating their 25th wedding anniversary. So here is a huge shout out to Matt and Angie. Happy anniversary. If you want to catch Angie on her podcast, it's Steady On, and I will link her podcast in the show notes. And it's very good if you, it's incredibly good. Bible study and encouraging stories of how the Lord has moved in people's lives, and I would highly, highly recommend it. So let's jump into the definition of love. To have a strong affection for, to need or thrive on, to derive delight from. And that's just 3 of many. And I think what caught my eye from those 3 is that I can really relate to them, because I have told Doug, I don't know if I've said it once, I've probably said it 100 times, you center me. And so when we're off, my world, my physical world, my mental world is wonky. And that's an outcropping of the love that I have for you.
You know, and things can go askew pretty quickly, and you have to be careful. One of the things that is so cool to me is that when we think we know how to love our spouse properly, we should continue to do those things, but we should also be aware of the fact that there's going to be a new opportunity. There's going to be a new opportunity nearly every day to show genuine love for our spouse. Now, some of those ways, for those of you who are thinking, I'm not sure I could demonstrate love differently than I'm currently demonstrating it. One of the resources I would strongly encourage you to go to is 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I know a lot of you are familiar with it. You know, love is patient, love is kind, love does not boast, etc. And as you go through that, you'd be amazed at how when you read through that, God might show you that you can love your spouse today by not keeping a record of wrongs. Because your spouse may have had a really bad day yesterday and done something that was wrong. You can love your spouse by not keeping a record of that. I don't need to bring that back up.
Or being kind.
Yes.
A lot of times, we get caught up in the daily grind, and it's stressful. And we come home, and the first person that we unload to is our spouse. And a lot of times, if we're on autopilot, that can come across as grouchy. It can come across as unkind. It can come across as unappealing.
Yeah. And so, the 1 Corinthians 13 list will give you a really good starting place. But I want to encourage you then beyond that to prayerfully seek ways that you can love your spouse in a way that your spouse will hear. We've mentioned the love languages a lot. When you find out what your spouse's love language is, being able to show your love in a way that your spouse will hear it, it can be really effective. So if your spouse's love language is gift giving, it doesn't have to be an expensive gift. You can give your spouse a flower that you picked. You can give, but giving a gift is something you know will allow your spouse to hear "I love you" beyond just the words "I love you." And by the way, tell your spouse you love your spouse as well. That's important too. But so I'd encourage you to figure out things that you can do within that love language. Now, don't be afraid to be creative. So if your spouse's love language is physical touch, you can do things simply by touching your spouse's shoulder while you walk by the room. My father-in-law, Leslie's dad, would show people he loved them simply by lightly stepping on their toes when he walked through the room. I mean, actually touching his foot to their toes as he walked through the room.
And he wouldn't say anything.
He would just
walk
step on your
through,
foot.
step on your foot, and keep on walking. And it just became probably the first time that it happened, it was an accident, and then it became a connection, and then it just continued because it got into a habit.
But then also look at the ways that your spouse shows love, because your spouse may still be in the process. Remember, you can only affect what you do. And, encourage your spouse to listen to this with you. But if they're not, don't get frustrated if your spouse is a little slower to demonstrate love in your language when you're trying to demonstrate love in your spouse's language. So for example, when Leslie's dad, his physical touch was the way he showed love, and so he would step on her toe, and it was an "I love you" on the way through the room, and she explained that to me. And while we were dating, it was right before we were engaged, right before I'd asked Leslie to marry me. I distinctly remember the first time that her dad walked through the room and he stepped on my foot. Because even though that wasn't something that would make me feel loved, I knew that that was the way he said "I love you." It made a big difference. So look for not only a way you can speak your spouse's love language, but look for them speaking in their language. It's worth having the interpreter in your heart.
Let me caveat that whole conversation just a little bit by explaining what we're talking about when we're talking about love languages, because we don't want to assume that you know where that's coming from. Gary Smalley wrote The 5 Love Languages, and I will link that book in the show notes for you. But they also developed a quiz that you can take to determine what your love language is. And here's the big deal with love languages. It's just like our spoken language. You can speak a language and hear in a language, and they might not be the same language. So if we're on autopilot, we generally speak the same language that we hear, right? But your spouse may not hear or speak the same love language. Right. And so it's important to know what each love language is for the spouse. So I would highly recommend you taking that quiz just to find out a little bit more about how you can express love to your spouse in a way that they understand it.
Or at least if you want to communicate clearly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, one of the second sets of vows that people take traditionally, I promise to love you. It's also, I promise to honor you, to love, honor, and then we'll get to the third one. So what exactly does it mean? We talked about honor in some detail in episode 11. And so I would encourage you to go back and look at honor. But the Bible tells us that that's the one thing that we're specifically to strive to outdo one another in doing. We're to outdo one another in showing honor. But what exactly does it look like to honor your spouse?
Well, I think one of the prefaces to honoring your spouse is that you have to come into those situations with at least an ounce of humility, because you can't lift someone up to a place of honor without first understanding your position in the relationship too. Right. So looking at honoring your spouse, here's the definition of honor: a recognition of importance or value and respect. So understanding that your spouse has a place of value, a place of importance in the relationship, and that they're not more important than you are, and that you are not more important than they are.
Right. And that's demonstrated in God's word in 1 Peter 3:7. Husbands are reminded that we're to live with our wives, understanding that we're different from one another. Our nature is different than our wives' nature. We're just different. And understanding that, we're to live with them, showing honor as co-heirs of the grace of life. As a matter of fact, God even says that we're to make sure that we recognize that we're different and to show them honor, even though we're different. And if we don't, it'll hinder our prayers. It's one of the few places, men, where we're told that it's something that will hinder our prayer life if we don't do it. So we're supposed to show honor to our wives, and wives, you are to show honor to your husbands too. But what that really means is recognition of the things that have goodness and are deserving of honor, because it's so easy for us just to point out the places where we fall short. It's so easy for us to point out the places where we could have done things differently or where we dropped the ball. And there's a place for all of that. There's a place for us to develop and get better through all of that. But the thing that we cannot forget to do is to show honor, to show the recognition, the worth, the things that are done well, the things that are said well, the things that are valuable traits. We need to recognize those.
I think one of the things that's important to do as you're delving into how you honor, looking at how you honor your spouse, is to think about the behavior that is dishonoring. I know one of the things, because we're in such a public setting at church, with Doug being a pastor and a pastor's wife and counselor on staff at our church, we're in the public view quite a bit. And one of the things early on, and you were a pastor, we'd only been married 7 years, probably. Yeah, probably about 7 years. But one of the things I committed early on to do was to absolutely never, ever talk badly in public. Even if I felt like the girlfriend that I was talking to was absolutely safe. She was confidant. She was confidential, and so that was a promise that I made in that covenant relationship, that I would never talk bad or what's the word, disparagingly, right? I would never talk disparagingly about Doug in public. And so but that doesn't mean I didn't pray for you really hard sometimes.
There were times where I deserved that. And likewise, Leslie is never used as an example unless it's something that she's said is okay to be able to be used as an example. That's really important to me. Anytime that I share anything publicly, I check with her before I say, hey, this happened to us.
I appreciate that.
And, one of the other things from episode 11 for you to be reminded of if you heard it, and to go back and listen to it if you haven't, is guys, it's none of that locker room talk. You know what I'm talking about, where the kiss and tell type things that would happen in high school locker rooms. None of that should ever exist in your marriage. And ladies, we're talking about none of the beauty parlor talk. The stuff when you get together to with your hairdresser, the things that float around the room, absolutely inappropriate for you to share those things within your marriage, because we've promised to honor. But we've also promised, one of the other traditional promises is we promise to cherish. Now, how is cherish different from love? Because we know that cherishing has to do with care and affection, and so does love. So what does it mean to cherish your spouse?
Well, let's read. Now, these definitions are simple. They're from a website that anybody can go to. They're from wordhippo.com, which is another website that Angie turned me on to, and I just thank her for that. But here is the definitions for cherish: to treat with tenderness, care, and affection, to nurture or protect with care, to hold dear and appreciate deeply.
Right. And so, I promise to love, I promise to honor, I promise to cherish.
There's a care aspect there, a taking care of each other.
And a demonstration that shows a recognition of value. Because it's one of those things that caring is the beginning point, cherishing is deeper. And, I was so thrilled to be able to have someone to cherish, that promise meant something to me, but I'm not sure that I fully understood all that it meant. I'll give you a couple of examples of how it had played out before I made the promise to Leslie to cherish her. I was unfortunately a little bit reckless as a young man as far as the way I would drive and some of the things that I would do. My physical health didn't concern me very much.
The song "I Can't Drive 55" comes to mind.
And so I drove very fast. I rode motorcycles very fast. I didn't wear a helmet. I didn't wear a seatbelt when I drove. All of those things are bad. Please don't do those. Those are illegal in most states. It's a bad idea. But that was the reality. And I would love to tell you that I changed those behaviors because I realized I should follow the law. You have to wear a seatbelt. I do wear a seatbelt. But that's not why it changed. It changed because of two people. It changed because of Leslie and our oldest daughter. I started driving slower because she was with me. I cared more about her physical safety than I ever did about mine. I didn't realize it until later that that was God building a heart within me that would cherish her. I believed and still believe that she was important enough for me to truly care for her. It's never an inconvenience the few times when she's sick to be able to bring her the things that she needs or to do the things for her that would make her day better. Caring for her, nurturing her is something that gives me the opportunity to live up to the promise that I made where I will cherish you.
That's why I love you.
Now, by the way, the cherishing did cause me to drive the speed limit. I mentioned that my daughter was involved too. I did finally start to wear my seatbelt when she was born because I knew that she needed to end up having a better chance of having a dad all the way through adulthood. And so, but you know, cherishing is showing care and affection, but it's recognizing the value. It's recognizing with tenderness. It's recognizing that you matter enough that I'm going to do whatever it takes to take care of you without hurting you in the process. Because that whole tenderness idea, we can take care of people roughly. Mm-hmm. That's not cherishing. It's taking care of someone while holding their heart with tender care.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think I read something somewhere sometime, I don't even remember where it was that I read it, but probably some psychology book as I was studying. But the premise was that it takes 10 times the amount of positive interaction to make up for one bad interaction. You know, so like one sloppy word or one untender moment, and you've got to work really hard to make that up. It takes like 10 times the amount.
Shouldn't be that way, but it is.
It is.
Yeah, and so we've got these promises that we make. I will love you. I will honor you. I will cherish you. But the next thing that we usually promise is forsaking all others, I'll cleave only to you forevermore. Okay, so we're going to separate those two because one of them is an intentional action to not do something, and the other one's an intentional action to do something. So we're going to separate them. So number 4 is actively forsaking all others. So what does it look like to forsake all others in our marriage?
Well, the wordhippo.com definition of forsake is to abandon, to give up, to leave permanently, and to renounce.
Right.
And so that's forsake.
Leaving permanently is kind of a big thing. Now, when we talk about forsaking all others, chances are your mind went to others that would be in a replacement relationship for your spouse, that I need to physically not be interested in anyone else. I need to emotionally not be interested in anyone else. And that is absolutely true. That's the most important of the things we're going to mention when it comes to forsaking all others. In other words, don't try to find what your spouse should be giving to you in anyone else.
And a lot of times that's really easy to do when you're on autopilot because you're drawn to whatever it is that's meeting that need. Mm-hmm. But you have to be able to protect that connection, your relationship with your spouse, with a godly zeal that just pushes that away so that you can protect that connection. And then if you are not getting what you need met in your relationship, that's an opportunity to sit down and talk about those things and develop those connections.
Well, and it's important because if you don't, that's when you see the slow fade happen. As a matter of fact, next week we want to encourage you to listen to our interview
Yes.
where you'll get to find out what happens, whether it's emotionally or physically, when a couple hasn't chosen to forsake all others and they've just kind of let that slide and that promise wasn't kept the way it should be. But the good news is there is forgiveness, there is restoration. And so I want to encourage you to listen to that. But it's not just making sure that you forsake someone who could physically or emotionally provide for you. I believe that this promise should be even more than just that. What if also forsaking all others means that you are forsaking your family of origin for your spouse? I've seen couple after couple after couple after couple struggle with the fact that they put their spouse in a position where the spouse feels like you're choosing your family instead of choosing your spouse. Whether it's choosing your mom or your dad or the family as a whole, instead of choosing your spouse, it creates a rift that shouldn't exist. As a matter of fact, the Bible says that it's for the reason of finding a spouse. For that reason, a man will leave his mother and father and cling only to his own wife. And so this promise where I'll forsake all others, it's not just I'll forsake, it's not just me as a husband, I'll forsake all women who could physically or emotionally satisfy me. It also should mean I will forsake my family's interests, instead putting your interests first.
I think that's a really, really important distinguish to make there, because we don't usually think about that. Like, that's not usually, because you're right. Usually it's it's that slow fade. It's that affair proofing your marriage, right? Where a spouse might be looking for attention outside of the relationship. But I have had people in the counseling office, I've had wives go, he won't leave his mom. Like, his mom's opinion is more important than my opinion.
Right.
Or a husband who's like, I can't live up to her dad.
Or every time she needs help, she calls her dad instead of me. And so we don't even think about the fact that biblically, forsaking all others means you're leaving your family and clinging to your spouse, to your wife. But, so I just want to encourage you that it means more than just don't cling, don't be drawn towards someone who could physically or emotionally satisfy you. I believe it's also make sure that your spouse is number one rather than your family. So when God says, to forsake all others for that reason, we made a promise, I will forsake all others. We need to prayerfully look at what does that look like in my relationship. But the final thing that most of us promised in our wedding vows is I promise to cleave or to cling only to you forevermore. So what exactly does it mean to cling or to cleave to your spouse?
Well, let's look at the definition of cling. To hold very tightly, to adhere to an object without being affixed. I really liked that definition and that phrase, without being affixed, because that means it's a choice. You make the choice to cling to your spouse.
And the choice is continual. And it does require strength, because if you were just affixed, you were just stuck there. But, it does require some strength, which you're going to need help perhaps having the strength, but it's a choice. And I like to look at the phrase hold fast. To cleave or to cling is to hold fast. And what that means, it's not just, hey, I'm forsaking everyone else, I'm holding on to you. Yeah, that's part of it. But it also means I'm going to hold fast to you in that everything about this relationship matters to me so much that it's going to be a relationship of ongoing exploration. It's going to be a relationship where every day I recognize the opportunity to enjoy one another fully, but to also enjoy one another exclusively. I want to say that again. You have the privilege to enjoy your spouse fully, but to also enjoy your spouse exclusively. And that promise, I'm going to cleave or cling to you forevermore. It's really what that looks like.
You see the smile? That I love exploring with you. I just say I love exploring with him. The that hold fast and that ongoing exploration. I want to tell a little story about what happened to us last weekend. We went on a writing retreat where we were hashing out a lot of the content that we're going to be sharing with you guys over the next few months. And it was really, really cool. All of the different concepts that we talked about and we wrote about and we were exploring together. What happened was, because we were talking about a covenant marriage, and what happened is I came up against a belief that I had about what breaks a covenant marriage. And we had to really delve into that, because what breaks a covenant marriage is so much more than what I like. My thought was, if he cheats or if I cheat, that covenant is broken, right? But it was deeper than that. And so we buckled down and really explored that together. And I had an epiphany about how a covenant marriage is broken, other than just infidelity. Because that's kind of what I was saying. I'm like, well, our covenant will never be broken unless you cheat on me, and then we talked about all of the different ways that a covenant can be broken. And it was fun and interesting to explore those concepts with you. And then we went to see a Cubs cards game, and it was really fun.
And so as we look at the promises that we made, all of these have the opportunity to be something that not only give you the chance to fulfill your promise every day, to live in these covenant principles is something that allows you to be a person of your word. It allows you to recognize the promise you made. It allows you to remember the promise your spouse made. But think about the beauty of this as well. It allows you an opportunity to love, honor, cherish, forsake all others, and cleave only to your own spouse in ways that maybe you haven't done previously, but in a way that helps you to fulfill that promise even more than you already have been. Every day, we have an opportunity to live up to the promises, to be people of our word, to truly do what we promised to do, so that we can be what our spouse truly needs us to be. To be quite honest with you, you can only live up to that promise when you understand what the promise is, understand who gives you the strength to live up to it. I want to strongly encourage you. Draw close to God. Pray that he will give you the strength to be able to love the way you should love, to honor the way you should honor, to cherish the way you should cherish. Make sure that those promises are something that not only bring a blessing into your relationship, but they're something that help develop you.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. I say that in about every episode, don't I? I just don't have anything to add to
So
that.
again, these have been 5 ways to fortify your marriage using covenant principles. We're Doug and Leslie Davis. This is the Vision Driven Marriage Podcast, and we pray that God will continue to solidify your marriage.
Thanks for listening. And if you think about it, give us a review wherever you